Imagine spending 7 years sharing a home with someone, giving everything you had to a marriage, only to feel completely unseen. That was my reality. When I finally left, there was no dramatic exit. I quietly walked out, leaving behind a silent house and a brief goodbye note. Days passed, then a week, but there wasn't a single call or message. She didn't even realize I was gone. But when she finally did, she wasn't just left to face her solitude. She also had to confront the life I took with me. Before we dive deeper into this story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this resonates with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss what's coming next. Ethan Carter sat on the edge of their living room couch, quietly observing his wife, Sophia Bennett, as she scrolled through her phone, fully engrossed. After 7 years of marriage, Ethan felt less like a partner and more like an invisible presence in their home. He had spent years pouring his heart into their relationship, anticipating her needs, striving to bring her happiness, and yearning for a genuine connection. Yet all his efforts seemed to vanish into thin air, dismissed as trivial in Sophia's self-centered world. Sophia, on the other hand, had grown increasingly detached and dismissive. Once warm and affectionate, she now barely acknowledged Ethan unless it served her needs. Her priorities had shifted entirely to her career, her social life, and even the most mundane distractions, while the man she had vowed to cherish seemed to fade into the background. For Ethan, each day felt like a losing battle to recapture even a fragment of the love they once shared. But the distance between them only grew. Ethan's frustration reached its peak one evening when he mustered the courage to address the suffocating silence that had consumed their relationship. Leaning forward, his voice a mix of hope and desperation, he asked, "Sophia, do you think we should work on improving our marriage?" His eyes searched hers for any sign of acknowledgement. Without even glancing up from her phone, Sophia replied curtly, "Why? I'm busy. Just do whatever you want." Her tone was cold and indifferent. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the chest. His throat tightened as he summoned the last of his patience to continue. "I feel like I'm just a shadow in this house," he said softly, hoping his vulnerability might spark a meaningful response. Finally, Sophia looked up, but only to deliver a mocking smirk. "If you don't like it, then leave," she said with a shrug, her tone devoid of any concern. Something broke inside Ethan at that moment. Her words weren't just dismissive, they were a blatant rejection of him, his feelings, and their marriage. As Sophia returned to her phone, Ethan realized he was done waiting for things to change. This time, when he left, it wouldn't be quiet, and she would finally understand the weight of what she had lost. In a last-ditch effort to salvage their marriage, Ethan convinced Sophia to attend couples therapy. For him, it was a chance to bridge the growing divide between them. For her, it was little more than a tedious obligation. Their first session began with Dr. Evelyn Monroe, a composed and empathetic therapist who had helped countless couples navigate troubled relationships. "Let's start with something simple," Dr. Monroe began, her tone warm but firm. "What do you both value most in a marriage?" Ethan's breath caught. Her response struck harder than he expected. "That's it?" he asked, unable to hide his disbelief. "What else is there?" she replied, clearly unmoved. "Everyone needs stability." Turning to Dr. Monroe, Ethan's voice wavered as he asked, "Is that all I am to her? A paycheck and a housekeeper?" Dr. Monroe met Ethan's gaze with quiet empathy, encouraging him to continue. "It feels like I've been trying so hard to be her partner, to give her love, support, everything she needs, but she doesn't even see me. I'm just convenient." Before Dr. Monroe could respond, Sophia interrupted defensively. "Don't twist my words, Ethan. I didn't say you're just a housekeeper. Stability is important. I like having a predictable life." "But what about love?" Ethan pressed, his voice trembling. "What about connection and companionship? Don't those matter to you?" Rolling her eyes, Sophia replied, "Of course they matter. You're just blowing this out of proportion." Ethan sank back into his chair, the weight of her indifference settling on his chest. Sensing the tension, Dr. Monroe leaned forward. "Sophia, do you understand why Ethan feels unappreciated?" With a shrug, Sophia replied, "I think he's overreacting. I'm not the romantic type, and he knows that." "Why are we even doing this? It's not like there's a real problem." Ethan stared at her, stunned. Her words weren't just dismissive, They were a refusal to acknowledge the cracks in their relationship. For years, he had carried the weight of their marriage, trying to fix problems she refused to see. Now, in the stark light of the therapy room, the truth was undeniable. Sophia didn't care. "How does that make you feel, Ethan?" Dr. Monroe asked gently. After a pause, Ethan answered, his voice quieter but steadier. "It makes me feel like I've been fooling myself. I've been holding on to something that doesn't exist. She doesn't see me as her partner, just as someone useful." That session was a turning point for Ethan. He realized his efforts to save their marriage were futile. Sophia's indifference wasn't a misunderstanding, it was an unshakable truth. By the time the session ended, Ethan's mindset had shifted. He no longer wanted to fight for their marriage. Instead, he resolved to fight for himself. Walking out of the therapy room that day, Ethan felt a sense of clarity. Sophia had chosen convenience over love, stability over connection, and in doing so, she had lost him. For Ethan, it wasn't just the end of a therapy session. It was the beginning of his journey to rediscover himself. He understood that saving himself required letting her go. The stillness of the private therapy room stood in stark contrast to the emotional storm raging within Ethan. Across from him, Dr. Evelyn Monroe waited patiently, allowing him the space to process his thoughts. After enduring weeks of therapy sessions alongside Sophia's dismissive attitude, this moment of solitude was a rare opportunity for Ethan to speak freely without interruption or invalidation. For the first time in what felt like ages, he voiced the truth he had been avoiding. "She doesn't love me," he said, his tone steady but weighted with finality. "She never did. I was just convenient." Dr. Monroe nodded, her expression full of understanding. "That's a difficult realization, Ethan, but it's also a moment of clarity. What do you want to do now?" A faint, resolute smile tugged at Ethan's lips. "I'm leaving," he stated firmly. There was no hesitation, no wavering. For the first time, Ethan felt a sense of control. The years of emotional neglect, sleepless nights spent agonizing over how to fix their one-sided relationship, and countless attempts to earn Sophia's affection had all led to this moment. He refused to leave as a victim. If Sophia valued convenience over connection, she would soon understand what it felt like to live without the comforts she had so readily taken for granted. Over the next few days, Ethan meticulously devised his plan. His actions weren't driven by malice, but by the need to reclaim his dignity. Every step he took was carefully thought out, grounded in practicality and his legal rights. He began with their joint bank account, where he had contributed the majority of the funds. Within the limits of legality, he moved his money into a private account, leaving the shared account nearly empty. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sophia, who had prized stability above all else, would soon learn how fragile her foundation was. Next, Ethan reviewed the household bills. Most of the utilities, electricity, water, internet, were in his name. He scheduled their disconnection for shortly after his planned departure. If Sophia had never bothered to handle these responsibilities, she would now face the challenge of managing them on her own. Going through Sophia's laptop and phone records, Ethan uncovered messages confirming her affair with Daniel Harris. Reading her words was like a knife to his chest, but it steeled his determination. He discreetly compiled the evidence, creating a complete record for any future legal proceedings. Consulting a lawyer, Ethan outlined his rights and began filing paperwork to protect his share of their marital assets. For the first time in years, he felt empowered, like he was reclaiming control over his own life. As his plan took shape, Ethan drafted a simple yet powerful note. "Sophia, thank you for teaching me a valuable lesson. I deserve more than to be an accessory in someone else's life. Enjoy the stability you hold so dear." He left the note on the dining table, a final statement in their lopsided relationship. Unlike the desperation he had felt just weeks ago, Ethan now moved with quiet determination. His decisions were deliberate, born not of anger, but of self-respect. He no longer sought Sophia's validation or hoped for her to change. Instead, he focused on ensuring she experienced the full weight of her actions. As he finalized his preparations, Ethan felt an unfamiliar sense of calm. For too long, he had lived in the shadow of someone who refused to see his worth. Now, he was stepping into the light, leaving Sophia to face the emptiness she had created. His departure wasn't merely an ending, it was a declaration. That evening, the house was unusually quiet, with only a faint breeze rustling the leaves outside. Ethan had just come home from work when an unexpected sound caught his attention. Laughter. It wasn't the casual laughter of a TV show or a phone call. It was vibrant, intimate, far too familiar. He froze in the hallway, unease creeping over him as he tried to pinpoint the source. Curiosity mingled with dread as Ethan moved toward the sliding glass door leading to the backyard. The patio lights illuminated the scene. Sophia reclined in a deck chair, a glass of wine in hand, chatting with a man Ethan instantly recognized. Daniel Harris, her so-called gym buddy. Their body language was relaxed, their smiles far too familiar. Ethan stepped outside, his chest tightening. "Gym buddy, drinking wine in my backyard," he said, his voice sharp but controlled. Sophia barely looked at him, her dismissive tone stoking his anger. "So what?" she replied. "Don't make this a big deal." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension, but Sophia remained unbothered. Her indifference was a slap in the face. "Not a big deal," Ethan repeated, his voice rising. "You're sitting here with another man, sharing wine, and that's not a big deal to you?" Sophia took a deliberate sip of her wine. "You're overreacting," she said coolly. "We're just talking. Maybe you should relax." Ethan stared at her, the weight of her disregard sinking in. This wasn't just disrespect, it was absolute dismissal. Turning to Daniel, he asked, his tone cutting, "And you? What are you doing here?" Daniel stammered. Sophia invited me for workout advice." Ethan scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Right, because wine and workouts go hand in hand." Sophia rolled her eyes. "Don't embarrass yourself, Ethan." In that moment, Ethan's anger gave way to icy clarity. There was no guilt in her voice, no shame in her posture. She didn't even try to deny the implications of her actions. She believed he wouldn't, or couldn't, do anything about it. Without another word, Ethan turned and walked back inside. His hands trembled as he shut the door, but his mind was already racing. If Sophia wanted to treat their marriage like a convenience, then it was time she experienced what life without it felt like. The laughter outside resumed, faint but piercing, echoing through the house. This time, it didn't ignite rage within Ethan. Instead, it strengthened his resolve. As he stood in the quiet kitchen, staring at the wine glasses on the counter, he felt a gruesome sense of purpose. Sophia's betrayal had stripped him of any illusions, but it had also given him the clarity he needed. This wasn't just the end of their marriage, it was the beginning of Ethan's reckoning. He felt the surge of anger coursing through him, tempered only by a newfound clarity. Her betrayal was not just a momentary lapse, it was deliberate, calculated, and utterly devoid of remorse. As he read further, a specific message caught his attention, solidifying any doubts that lingered in his mind. "Sophia, he's so clueless. I could disappear for days and he'd probably never notice. Daniel, why don't you just leave him already? Sophia, why would I? I'd lose the house, the money, everything. No thanks." Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the screen. The audacity of her words hit harder than he anticipated. She wasn't just unfaithful, she was blatantly exploiting him, using him as a means to sustain her comfortable lifestyle. He closed the laptop with a quiet click, the betrayal sitting like a heavy weight in his chest. Yet alongside the pain came a sense of focus. The puzzle pieces had all fallen into place, leaving no room for illusions. It wasn't just love that Sophia lacked for him, it was respect, empathy, and any sense of loyalty. The initial shock began to dissipate, replaced by a steely determination. Confronting her wasn't the answer. No, this would require a strategy. Her messages made it clear Sophia valued convenience above all else. If she couldn't appreciate the life he had built for her, then she would face it crumbling, piece by piece. As Ethan stood, a calm resolve settled over him. The path forward was undeniable. Sophia had chosen to play games with his trust, underestimating his capacity for action. She thought she knew him, thought he was predictable, but she was about to realize just how wrong she was. For Ethan, the betrayal wasn't just proof of her infidelity, it was the spark that reignited his sense of self. Instead of allowing despair to consume him, Ethan used it as fuel for a plan that was as methodical as it was resolute. He had poured years of his life into a marriage that rewarded him with indifference and deceit. Now, he would leave, but not without ensuring Sophia felt the full impact of her choices. His first step was straightforward. The joint bank account, which he had primarily funded for years, would be the initial target. From paying the mortgage to covering everyday expenses, Ethan had been the financial backbone of their household, and Sophia had taken it all for granted. Late one evening, he logged into their shared online banking account. With calm precision, he transferred the bulk of the funds into his personal account, leaving only a modest amount behind. The remaining balance was just enough to cover small automatic payments, ensuring she wouldn't notice the change until after he was gone. When the transfer was complete, Ethan stared at the confirmation message on the screen. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of liberation. He was reclaiming control over his life, one transaction at a time. The next part of his plan was deeply personal. Sophia had spent years crafting a social persona that was polished and admired. Her friends and family held her in high regard. But Ethan knew the truth, and now it was time for others to see it too. Carefully, he compiled the damning messages between Sophia and Daniel into an organized, indisputable collection. Screenshots of their conversations, complete with timestamps, told the full story of her betrayal. Ethan considered sending the evidence anonymously, but decided against it. Attaching his name to the messages would leave no room for misinterpretation. That evening, he composed a concise email addressed to Sophia's closest friends and family. I regret to inform you that Sophia has not been honest about her commitments in our marriage. Attached are messages providing context. I believe you deserve to know the truth. Ethan. Clicking send was both cathartic and bittersweet. This wasn't about revenge born of anger. It was about accountability. Sophia had woven a web of lies, and it was time for her to face the consequences. Sophia had also relied on Ethan to handle the logistical aspects of their home, utilities, internet, and even streaming subscriptions. She had never bothered to understand how these systems worked, assuming they would always be there. Over the next few days, Ethan contacted each service provider, systematically canceling every account. Electricity, water, and internet were scheduled to be disconnected shortly after his departure. When asked if he wanted to transfer the accounts to someone else, Ethan declined. Cancel them outright, he said firmly, his tone detached but inwardly satisfied. For once, Sophia would have to confront the reality of her dependence. The final step of his plan required legal guidance. Meeting with a lawyer, Ethan ensured that his rights were protected. Though the house was in both their names, he had been the one financing it almost entirely. The lawyer assured him he had a strong case for reclaiming his share of the assets. Quietly, Ethan filed for divorce, documenting every detail to minimize Sophia's ability to contest or manipulate the process. All the while, Sophia remained oblivious. She spent her days texting Daniel, lounging in the house, Ethan maintained, and scrolling through social media. Her ignorance only strengthened Ethan's resolve. On the eve of his departure, Ethan wrote a short, pointed note and placed it on the kitchen counter. Sophia, I've spent years giving you love, respect, and stability. You've given me betrayal and indifference. Enjoy the life you've built for yourself because I won't be a part of it anymore. Ethan. As he packed his bags that night, Ethan felt an unexpected calm wash over him. He moved methodically, taking only what he needed: clothes, his laptop, and a few personal belongings. Everything else he left behind. The house and its contents no longer felt like his. They were relics of a life that Sophia had rendered meaningless. Before leaving, he took one last look around the living room. The furniture, the photos, the memories, they all felt distant, like artifacts of another lifetime. Placing the note in a spot he knew Sophia would see, he stepped out the door without looking back. For Ethan, this wasn't just an exit. It was the start of a new chapter. For Sophia, it would be a reckoning she never saw coming. I deserve a life where I'm not a supporting character in someone else's story. You've shown me what stability means to you. Now, I hope you enjoy it alone. Goodbye. Ethan reread the note one last time, making sure it conveyed every sentiment he intended. It wasn't vengeful, nor was it forgiving. It was truthful, a final acknowledgement of what their relationship had become, and a clear statement of his decision to move forward. Before leaving, Ethan took a final walk through the house. His footsteps echoed softly as he moved through each room, the spaces filled with memories that now felt more like specters. The living room, once a place of shared laughter, now felt cold and lifeless. The kitchen, where they had enjoyed countless meals together, now stood as a silent monument to their growing distance. Standing at the front door, Ethan took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle. With steady resolve, he stepped out and pulled the door shut behind him. The sound of the lock clicking into place felt like the last punctuation mark on a story that had ended long ago. He didn't look back. For the first time in years, he was stepping forward into a future that was entirely his own. Days passed in silence, and Sophia barely noticed Ethan's absence. Her daily routine continued uninterrupted, scrolling endlessly through social media, exchanging playful texts with Daniel, and sipping coffee each morning without a second thought. The quiet house didn't strike her as odd. In fact, she welcomed it as a reprieve. In her mind, Ethan was simply sulking somewhere, upset over something trivial. She didn't check the joint account or wonder about his whereabouts when he wasn't around. His absence didn't feel unusual because to her, Ethan had long since faded into the background of her life. One evening, lounging on the couch, her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. Their playful banter quickly resumed, his attention feeding her ego. Ethan didn't cross her mind, not once. To Sophia, he existed solely to maintain her comfortable lifestyle. The idea that he might have left her, or that he was even capable of doing so, never entered her thoughts. Occasionally, she noticed small changes, a missing pair of shoes, or his laptop gone from the counter, but dismissed them without a second thought. He's probably just reorganizing, she muttered, brushing the observations aside. As the week wore on, the silence in the house persisted, but Sophia remained oblivious. Her indifference was so ingrained that it shielded her from the reality of what had happened. Ethan, the man she had so easily dismissed, was gone. But she was too absorbed in her own world to realize it. Her bubble of ignorance burst when the cracks in her carefully curated life became impossible to ignore. Sophia sat across from the bank teller, her manicured nails drumming impatiently on the counter. She had come to the bank to resolve a declined payment, convinced it was a minor error. But as the teller examined her account, his expression shifted, revealing something more serious. Ma'am, he said hesitantly, your joint account shows a remaining balance of $752. Sophia blinked, struggling to process the number. That can't be right, she snapped, leaning forward. Check again. There's no way it's that low. The teller nodded, typing quickly. It appears there were several large withdrawals earlier this week. Were you aware of these transactions? Her heart raced. No, I wasn't. What kind of bank allows someone to empty an account without notifying me? Her voice rose with each word, drawing the attention of nearby customers. She didn't care. Ma'am, the teller explained calmly, though his discomfort was evident. The withdrawals were made by the primary account holder. That person is fully authorized to access the funds. Realization hit her like a freight train. Ethan, she hissed under her breath. Standing abruptly, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the bank, her mind spinning. For the first time, the foundation of her stability felt like it was crumbling. The day only worsened. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages, each one more damning than the last. She assumed they were from Daniel, but the tone of the notifications quickly dispelled that notion. The first was from her mother. Sophia, what is this? How could you do this to Ethan? Her stomach churned as she opened another, this one from a close friend. I can't believe you'd betray Ethan like that. Don't ever ask me for anything again. Panic set in as she scrolled through dozens of similar messages. One included a screenshot, a record of her private conversations with Daniel. Every word was laid bare. Her mockery of Ethan, admissions of using him, and flirtatious exchanges with Daniel. Her phone slipped from her hand as the weight of humiliation sank in. How had Ethan managed to gather all of this? And worse, why had he sent it to everyone she knew? Desperately, she called her mother, who answered on the first ring. How could you do this? Her mother demanded, her voice trembling with disappointment. Ethan gave you everything. He loved and supported you. And this is how you repay him? Mom, it's not what it looks like, Sophia began. But her mother cut her off. Don't you dare lie to me. Everyone has seen the messages. You've embarrassed yourself and disgraced this family. The line went dead, leaving Sophia frozen in place. The full extent of her public disgrace became apparent within hours. Friends ignored her texts, colleagues avoided her calls, and even Daniel stopped responding. The social network she had meticulously built was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The next morning brought no relief. The house was silent, its stillness now suffocating. Flipping the bedroom light switch, she frowned when nothing happened. Assuming it was a power outage, she wandered into the kitchen only to find the electricity was out there too. Shrugging it off, she attempted to connect to the internet, but the Wi-Fi was also down. Annoyed, she grabbed her phone to call the utility company, but an email notification stopped her in her tracks. Final notice: water service terminated due to non-payment. Panic gripped her. Frantically rifling through the stack of bills on the counter, she saw a pattern. Final notices, overdue payments, and service termination warnings. Every account had been under Ethan's name. Now that he was gone, they were effectively shut off. Her so-called stability had been a fragile illusion, and now it was crumbling entirely. By the afternoon, desperation replaced frustration. Without electricity, water, or internet, her life of convenience had been stripped away. Sitting in the dim light of the living room, Sophia finally faced the uncomfortable truth. Ethan was gone, and with him went everything she had taken for granted. She was alone, left with nothing but regret and the wreckage of her choices. I deserve a life where I'm not just a supporting player in someone else's story. You've shown me what stability means to you. Now I hope you enjoy it alone. Goodbye. Ethan reread the note carefully, ensuring it captured everything he needed to say. It was neither vengeful nor forgiving, just truthful. It reflected his gratitude for the lessons learned, his determination to move forward, and an acknowledgement of Sophia's indifference. Before departing, Ethan walked through the house one last time. His steps echoed softly in the emptiness, each room stirring memories that now felt like distant shadows. The living room, once filled with laughter, now felt hollow and lifeless. The kitchen, where they had shared countless meals, seemed like a monument to their growing distance. Standing at the front door, he inhaled deeply, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then, with quiet determination, he stepped outside, closing the door behind him. The soft click of the lock was the final punctuation on a story that had already ended. For the first time in years, Ethan was stepping forward into a new chapter of his life. Days went by, and Sophia barely noticed Ethan's absence. Her routine carried on as usual, scrolling through social media, exchanging flirty texts with Daniel, and sipping her morning coffee without a second thought. The silence in the house didn't strike her as unusual. In fact, she welcomed it. To her, Ethan was likely off sulking somewhere over another trivial issue. She didn't bother checking their joint account or questioning his absence. His presence had long since faded into the background of her life. One evening, lounging on the couch, Sophia's phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. She eagerly resumed their playful banter, his attention feeding her ego. Ethan didn't cross her mind once. In her world, he existed solely to maintain her comfortable lifestyle, and the idea that he might leave was something she never even considered. Occasionally, she noticed small changes, a missing pair of shoes, his laptop gone from the counter, but dismissed them as unimportant. He's probably reorganizing, she muttered. The reality of Ethan's departure remained a mystery to her, until the cracks in her carefully constructed world became impossible to ignore. Sophia sat at the bank, her manicured nails tapping impatiently on the counter. She had come to resolve a declined payment, convinced it was a minor glitch. But as the teller reviewed her account, his expression shifted to one of awkward sympathy. "Ma'am," he began hesitantly, "your joint account has a remaining balance of $752. Sophia's eyes widened in disbelief. "That's impossible," she snapped. "Check again. There's no way it's that low." The teller nodded, typing quickly. "There were several large withdrawals earlier this week. Were you aware of these transactions?" Her heart began to race. "No, what kind of bank lets someone drain an account without notifying me?" she shouted, drawing attention from nearby customers. "Ma'am," the teller replied calmly, though his discomfort was apparent. "The primary account holder made the withdrawals. They're fully authorized to do so." It hit her like a freight train. "Ethan," she muttered under her breath, grabbing her purse and storming out of the bank. For the first time, the foundation of her stability felt like it was crumbling. Her day worsened when her phone began buzzing incessantly with messages. At first, she assumed it was Daniel, but the tone of the notifications quickly told her otherwise. The first message was from her mother. "Sophia, how could you do this to Ethan?" Another came from a close friend. "I can't believe you'd betray him. Don't ever ask me for anything again." Panic set in as she scrolled through dozens of similar messages. One included a screenshot of her private conversations with Daniel. Every word was laid bare. Her mockery of Ethan, her confessions of using him, and her flirtatious exchanges with Daniel. The phone slipped from her trembling hand as humiliation washed over her. How had Ethan managed to gather all of this? And why had he sent it to everyone she knew? In desperation, she called her mother. "Mom, it's not what it looks like," she began, her voice trembling. "Don't lie to me," her mother snapped. "Everyone's seen the messages. You've disgraced yourself and this family." The line went dead, leaving Sophia frozen in place. Over the next few hours, the extent of her public humiliation became clear. Friends ignored her texts, colleagues avoided her calls, and even Daniel stopped responding. The social network she had meticulously curated crumbled, leaving her isolated. The next morning, Sophia woke to an eerily silent house. She flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. Confused, she wandered into the kitchen, only to find the electricity out there as well. Shrugging it off as a power outage, she tried connecting to the internet, but the Wi-Fi was down too. Annoyed, she grabbed her phone to call the utility company, but an email notification stopped her. Final notice: water service terminated due to non-payment. Panic gripped her as she realized the pattern. Bills, overdue notices, and service termination warnings cluttered the counter. Ethan had handled all their household logistics, and now that he was gone, everything was falling apart. By the afternoon, desperation replaced frustration. Without electricity, water, or internet, her comfortable lifestyle had been stripped away. Sitting in the dim light of the living room, Sophia finally faced the consequences of her choices. She was alone, and the stability she had clung to so tightly was gone. Meanwhile, Ethan's life had transformed. He stood on a sunlit beach, a camera slung over his shoulder, capturing a vibrant sunset. Photography, a passion he had abandoned, now filled his days with purpose. Beside him stood Lily, a kind, supportive woman he had met at a gallery. Her laughter was genuine, her love unconditional, a stark contrast to the indifference he had endured with Sophia. One day, Sophia stumbled upon a photo of Ethan and Lily online. They were laughing together, standing against a backdrop of sunlit waves. Ethan's joy was unmistakable, his expression one she had never truly seen before. Setting her phone down, Sophia felt an ache she couldn't name. Ethan had moved on, found happiness, and rebuilt his life without her. As Sophia sat in her dim apartment, she whispered into the silence, "I was wrong." But the words were swallowed by the emptiness around her. It was too late. Stability wasn't about money or convenience. It was about love, respect, and connection. Ethan had found all of those things, just not with her.